This playlist collects together and organizes the individual component modules, which together will comprise the first of 2 lectures discussing the ultimate disposition of behaviorism. Now, I say the disposition of behaviorism and not the refutation or the downfall or the rejection of behaviorism, precisely because behaviorists studied and generated empirically adequate predictive models of real phenomenon that were brought about by a set of underlying neurophysiological mechanisms. What ultimately we'll see rejected from behaviorism is a particular conception of what psychology as a science should be studying, and a particular conception of the role of classical and operant conditioning in the overall understanding of cognitive phenomenon. In fact, it's the non-cognitive approach to the study of classical and operant conditioning that is really what gets rejected primarily. Now, adding an additional complication to this is the fact that the way in which this reconceptualization of what behaviorists had discovered and were effectively investigating is part of a general mythos about the ultimate emergence of cognitive psychology and cognitive science generally. And that mythos is centered in philosophy oftentimes around this debate between Skinner and Chomsky, which really wasn't a debate. It was simply Chomsky reviewing and bringing up a number of pertinent criticisms already available in the literature. A book by Skinner, which was very speculative, some might say irresponsibly speculative, with regard to behaviorism's ability to explain language learning. Now, in our lecture, we'll begin by looking at Skinner's argument for why it is that we should engage in his functional analysis formulation of the behaviorist project. And then we'll turn our attention to Chomsky's specific criticisms in his review of verbal behavior. The defense or argument in favor of adopting Skinner's kind of radical behaviorism is taken from his textbook Science and Human Behavior, published in 1953, and so reflects, I think, a mature statement of Skinner's position. In that book, he specifically argues why he thinks behaviorism is the approach that should be adopted by psychology. So on his view, the proper goal of psychology is the prediction and control of behavior, and he outlines 4 possible means or methodologies for accomplishing this goal. The first is through introspection and inner causes. The second through neuroscience. There is behaviorism. And finally, the 4th possibility is appeals to ends or purposes. Now, Skinner is using a classical argument style. He's got a disjunction. He's going to eliminate all of the possibilities but one and claim that the remaining possibility must be true, since it's the only one that hasn't been shown to be false. As regards introspection and appeals to inner causes, he says introspectionism has no scientifically acceptable means of observation. It therefore lends itself to the formulation of untestable hypotheses. Its explanations tend to be either pseudo-explanations, redundant descriptions, or unnecessary and eliminable middle steps in the relationship between stimulus and response. It must be, therefore, rejected as a possible methodology. And this is a relatively long quote from that paper that illustrates his point. So he says, the commonest inner causes have no specific dimension at all, either neurological or psychic. When we say that a man eats because he is hungry, smokes a great deal because he has a tobacco habit, fights because of the instinct of pugnacity, behaves brilliantly because of his intelligence, or plays piano well because of his musical ability, we seem to be referring to causes. But on analysis, these phrases prove to be merely redundant descriptions. A single set of facts is described by 2 statements. He eats and he is hungry. A single set of facts is described by 2 statements. He smokes a great deal and he has a smoking habit. Interestingly enough, in offering up this criticism, Skinner is echoing a criticism offered up by Molière in The Imaginary Invalid, where he talks about a physician explaining why it is that opium puts you to sleep by saying that it has a dormitive virtue. In discussing neuroscience or neural activity, Skinner says, "We may note here too that we do not have and may never have this sort of neurological information at the moment it is needed in order to predict a specific instance of behavior. It is even more unlikely that we shall be able to alter the nervous system directly in order to set up the antecedent conditions of a particular instance. The causes to be sought in the nervous system are therefore of limited usefulness in the prediction and control of specific behavior." Thus, we find Skinner proclaiming that neuroscience is underdeveloped, its preconditions are not normally accessible for the purposes of prediction, and we cannot manipulate neural states to control specific behaviors, and therefore he thinks that it must be rejected as a possible methodology. The third alternative that he considers is this appeal to ends or purposes, and he claims here that ends or purposes are just covert appeals to controlling variables. Purpose, he says, is not a property of the behavior itself. It is a way of referring to controlling variables. We often don't have access to the real variables ourselves, but they are observable, he thinks, in our history and our environment, and so on. Thus, Skinner tells us that leaves only behaviorism as the last remaining plausible candidate. Operant conditioning, he asserts, can lead to prediction and control of behavior. Its hypotheses are testable through observation, and its preconditions are generally available and manipulable.